Welcome to this episode of Intellectual Catholicism. Today I'm here with my good friend Kyle Alander, Christian idealism himself. Kyle, it's good to have you on the show. And today you're going to be talking about the predictive power of theism. And I'll let you kind of present. And then at the end, I'm going to ask some questions. Obviously, we'll take audience questions as well. Like for the audience, I'll let you know when it's about time to start asking questions in the chat because I've noticed in the past that at some point, like I can't read any more questions beyond a certain threshold. Like the browser or something won't show it. So I'm hoping that won't happen. But, that's just something to keep in mind. But Kyle, how are you doing? It's good to see you again.
Yeah, pretty good. I know last time I was on your show, I was a Protestant and now I'm a Catholic. And I actually, it was actually a lot of your work that convinced me of Catholicism itself. So this past year has been very interesting for me in particular, my conversion to Catholicism. But I just want to put that out there because I know this is a Catholic channel. And so I appreciate your work, Suan, because you've helped me taking Catholicism seriously.
Hey, Kyle, that means a lot. And also, I like the new background you have there. It looks really nice and clean.
Yeah, well, because I recently moved, because now I go out to Sac State, so I had to move to a new location. So no more red background.
Yeah.
But yeah.
I just saw this funny comment by Kyle Whittington. I'm not sure if we have too many or not enough Kyles in the church. That's so funny.
It's funny.
Well, Kyle Alander, let's begin your presentation then. And, I'll pull it up on the screen here. And from there, just let me actually move the banner because I think it's in the way of your slide.
There you go, yeah. So before I begin, I just want to reference Tim Howard. Unfortunately, he couldn't be here, but me and him kind of put this together. We presented this same presentation on Capturing Christianity, but today I'm going to present the same here. And we're not going to go as long as I did on his channel, but we're just going to go over some of the things that we went over. And this presentation is actually it was actually influenced by the work of Richard Swinburne himself. Sort of an update on Swinburne's work. And this is accumulation of, I would say, 2 to 3 years of research that me and Tim have had in terms of the philosophy of religion, like thinking about, how does theism work as a hypothesis? So what I'm going to do today is I'm not going to present like this brand new argument for theism or something like that, but rather it's a framework for how we can understand arguments for theism. And that when we put it into the framework, that it actually would help to not only explain, how theism works as an explanation, but also how it can protect against certain objections that you'll hear from atheists, right? So near the end, I have a section respond to objection. We'll get to that, but I just wanted to push it out there. I guess the purpose of this presentation, this isn't like a new argument for theism, but it's a new kind of framework for understanding arguments for theism and evidence for theism and how we should approach this. So let me get started. So there's 4 main things I'm going to go over in this presentation. First is what's called epicenter probability. Second is some sort of axiological framework, and I'll get into that in background knowledge. Third is the evidence for theism itself. And then fourth is just answering some objections. So let's start off with epicenter probability. Now, epicenter probability is basically, as it's defined in the literature, is basically just the degree to which one proposition makes another likely. Now, there are 2 types of epicenter probability. There's what's called basic probabilities and non-basic probabilities. So, of course, a non-basic probability is just probabilities that are determined by the values of other probabilities. And then you have what's called basic probabilities. And the work of Nevin Kalamhanga, he says that basic probabilities are just basically defined as the elementary quantities out of which other probabilities are built. They're the atoms of probability theory. So when we're talking about a basic probability, that probability is not going to be determined by some other probability, right? So it's kind of basic in that sort of way. And I'll get more into like what this means for making the distinctions between intrinsic probability and posterior probability and prior probability and all that stuff. But I just wanted to these are kind of like the 2 main types of epicenter probability that you'll see in the literature. So there's kind of 2 questions when it comes to probability theory that we want to ask. The first one is a more structural question. So which probabilities are basic? And then the second question is how are the values of these basic probabilities determined? Now, what's interesting is that for the purpose of this presentation, I'm only going to be focusing on the first question, just because the way that the view that I hold to when it comes to probability theory is going to be a little bit different than what you'll see in some of the philosophy religion community, and I'll get into that in a moment. But so these are kind of the two main views when it comes to, again, the structure of epistemic probability. So on the left side, you have what's called orthodox Bayesianism. So in orthodox Bayesianism, basic probabilities are the unconditional probabilities of complete worlds. And on this kind of view, you would also say that the intrinsic probability of a world is the total number of claims it makes. So this is where you get some arguments like from Paul Draper or Graham Oppie, where basically, well, naturalism has more intrinsic probability than theism because it's more simple, it's more modest, it's more coherent, right? And of course, on this view, you would also say that only some probabilities are conditional, because again, so basically we could say is on the orthodox view of Bayesianism, the probabilities that are conditional are going to be probabilities that are non-basic, and then any basic probability is just going to be unconditional probabilities, right? And then when you try to figure out, okay, well, when we're talking about basic probabilities, if they're the unconditional probabilities of complete worlds, then when we judge an intrinsic probability, so how probable it is independently of any evidence or independently of any other claims, we just look at the claims it makes. The more modest a hypothesis is, the more coherent a hypothesis is, the more intrinsically probable it is, right? But this is, of course, one view of epistemic probability, and there's another view which is called explanationism. So on explanationism, basic probabilities are the probabilities of atomic propositions conditional on potential direct explanations. And so on this view, you could say that prior probabilities are determined by what's called higher order theories. And on this view, of course, all probabilities are conditional. So even intrinsic probability is going to be conditional. So I have a sort of definition of intrinsic probability when it comes to explanationism. So in explanationism, the intrinsic probability of a world is a function of how simple are the highest level hypotheses which it contains, and how well they are able to explain, because it's explanationism, all the other propositions which the world contains, rather than the totality of the conjunctive hypotheses. So what's interesting is that on explanationism, the intrinsic probability is not going to be in terms of simplicity. In fact, Nevin Kalamanga himself has an unpublished paper. It's called "Are Simpler Worlds More Probable?" and he goes over sort of the main issues with, at least in orthodox treatments of probability, where they try to argue that the simpler worldview, the worldview with the least amount of claims is the most probable, and he shows like no, that's not actually true on an explanationist view, because in explanationism all probabilities are conditional. So all probabilities have to be conditionalized upon potential direct explanations rather than just unconditional probabilities. In fact, you could say that there is no such thing as an unconditional probability in the formal sense within explanationism. Now, this is going to be relevant. The reason why me and Tim kind of put this here, how is this relevant to the presentation? Well, actually, there's some objections that we're going to go over later that explanationism would actually push and show like, hey, those objections don't work once we have explanationism as our theory of probability rather than the orthodox view of probability.
Yeah.
So I hope that makes sense to the audience.
Yeah.
Now,
So Kyle, you're defending explanationism, right?
yeah.
Yeah. It's funny because as soon as you kind of laid out both views, my intuition immediately jumped to explanationism over orthodox Bayesianism. So I guess my intuitions are working properly.
No, yeah, that is, yeah. It's funny because on the next, let me see, on the next slide. So there is actually some advantages to explanationism over orthodox Bayesianism. These are the 5 sort of main arguments that Nevin Kalamanga makes in his paper on the structure of epistemic probabilities. And basically, as I say, so number 1 is that conditional probabilities of atomic propositions may be well defined when associated unconditional state descriptions probabilities are not. The probabilistic explanations identified as basic can be more directly perceived than those that orthodoxy identifies as basic. So I guess that kind of fits with your own like intuitions in terms of like how we look at basic probabilities, right? And of course, explanationism better models actual probabilistic reasoning. So I'll get more into this later, especially on background knowledge. Explanationism combines more easily with probabilistic calculus for causal interventions, and finally, substantive methods for determining the values of basic probabilities get wrong results if applied to orthodox basic probabilities. Now, these arguments, again, I would reference the paper by Nevin Kalamhanga. You can look it up on Google. The paper is called The Structure of Epicenter Probabilities, and these are the 5 main reasons he goes over in that paper, and he defends each one in detail. But I just wanted to push that out for the audience that because for the rest of this presentation, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be assuming an explanationist view of Bayesianism rather than the orthodox view of Bayesianism. So now let's get to how me and Tim put this together, but how we view epicenter probabilities is that probabilities are mind-independent support relations between propositions. So you have the probability of A and B. So the probability of A conditional on B is the degree to which B supports A, and the unconditional probability of A as the degree to which A is supported by prior truths or tautologies. Now, another thing in regards to how we view epicenter probabilities is how we actually view evidence. So me and Tim hold to, and also Trent Dowdery also holds this view. It's called the positive relevance thesis. So basically, it's the idea that E is evidence for H if and only if the probability of hypothesis and E, so the hypothesis with the evidence, is greater than just the hypothesis itself. That is, if and only if E raises the probability of hypothesis above what it was when E was not taken into account. So this is the positive relevance view of evidence. And again, the reason why I put this out is because this is the view of evidence that I'm going to be operated on for the rest of this presentation. So just, when you're thinking like, hey, like when we're talking about, evidence for theism, this is what when we're talking about evidence for theism, I'm using both a positive relevance view of evidence, and then I'm using the explanationist kind of structure of how we look at these. Hold on, okay. So now let's get into axiology, and I'll discuss a little bit what that means, and then background knowledge. So background knowledge. So the criteria of background knowledge is basically that this criteria assesses whether a postulated explanation or any explanation within science or history or whatever meshes with other fields of explanations, right? So an explanation fits with background knowledge if the causes or entities invoked by the explanation are simpler than those causes or entities that are taken to exist within other neighboring fields. So basically, as an example, like if I'm going to posit some, like if I come up with a new theory of, like, let's say atoms or something, well, I'm going to have to make sure that atoms, right, are part of my background knowledge within other neighboring fields so that we can actually sort of understand, like, hey, like we're not just making stuff up. Like these are things that are already postulated in other fields, and we're not just coming up with new things that like we don't know anything about, right? So that's basically the criteria of background knowledge. Now, what's interesting is that a lot of arguments against theism, especially when it comes to in the philosophy of religion, is that theism actually violates background knowledge. So atheist philosophers have argued that theism is inconsistent with background knowledge because it is outside our experience. So, you could say, if we say that God is a spirit, well, we don't see spirits postulated in other fields of inquiry, right? Or we could say, well, God is some, I don't know, some like mind, that unembodied mind or something. Well, then what the atheist is going to say is, well, we don't have any experience of unembodied minds, right? But what's interesting is that I think this objection can actually be easily addressed when we model God as a trope, right? So I'll get more into trope theory in a minute, but basically trope theory is discussed in contemporary metaphysics, right? So if we view God as a trope rather than some spirit or unembodied mind, then it actually would be consistent with background knowledge. And I'll get into the next slide to kind of explain what trope theory is. So trope theory is basically a view where you have so there's two types of tropes. There's what's called module tropes and then modifier tropes. Now, in the case of God would actually be what's called a module trope because a module trope has causal powers, whereas a trope doesn't. So basically, I mean, when I talk about tropes, I'm not saying like these are abstract objects, but rather you can call them something like a quasi-universal. So they're what universals would do, but without using universals, if that makes sense. Now, what's interesting is that for God, so God is actually going to be one module trope. He's going to be a particular kind of module trope. In this case, he's going to be an omnipotence trope. And what's interesting is that this is actually very consistent with divine simplicity because tropes don't have like properties. Like tropes aren't things that like have properties like other things do. They don't have composite, So like, for example, if I'm sitting on a red chair, well, the redness in that chair, that's going to be one aspect, that'd be one trope, and then you have some other tropes that describe other aspects of the chair, right? That's what's called a bundle of tropes, right? So when we're talking about, like, when we're using metaphysical modeling or trying to explain the world with some kind of trope theory, what people are typically going to refer to as a bundle of tropes, right? And in a bundle of tropes, when you put them all together, is going to be, it's going to do the same thing as what's called the substance. But for God, God is not going to be a bundle of tropes. He's just going to be one trope. He's going to be a particular kind of trope, which is an omnipotence trope. So omnipotence trope is basically just something that has unlimited power. There's power without limit, right? So you could say that God is a non-composite entity, and his attributes, so omnipotence, omniscience, omnibenevolence, etc., are going to be identical to God, right? Not identical in the numerical sense, but rather they're going to be identical in the identical sense, right? If that makes, well, actually, I might have said that wrong. I might have said that wrong, actually, but I hope that makes sense to people. So we would say is that God, if he exists, is a fundamental entity through his metaphysical simplicity. Now, it's interesting is that if you want more research on this particular view, I would reference Joshua Shijawadi. He has a paper called Divine Simplicity, the aspectival account, and he kind of goes over a little bit more of the details of this. But this is kind of the view of God that I hold to, that Tim holds to, and we think that this actually would bypass a lot of the background objections that you see from atheist philosophers on this subject. So if you have any questions, Suan, you can stop me if you want, but this is the part of the presentation that people have a hard time understanding. So,
well, let me ask this. What's the difference between a trope and a property?
Right. So a property, at least in the traditional sense, is going to be attributed to a substance. So you have a property that's attached to a substance. But a trope in this case just is identical to its property. So it doesn't require a substance in the Aristotelian sense. Right. So that's basically the main sort of distinction there. And you could say is like, another way you could say is, well, okay, well, does that mean that God is a property? Well, yeah, but it's not going to be a property in the traditional sense of how we understand properties. It just means that God isn't going to be made of like an Aristotelian substance. He's just going to be a trope. He's just going to be identical to his property. And if go to this last slide, that's kind of the view. So you have, omnipotence, which that's what God is. And then you have goodness as an aspect of omnipotence, freedom as an aspect of omnipotence. So these aren't different properties, right? So omniscience, goodness, omnipresence, freedom, those aren't different properties that God has. Those are numerically identical to God, but these are just aspects of the same property, omnipotence, if that makes sense. So that's why it's compatible with divine simplicity, because we're not positing these different properties and then somehow when they all come together, that's what God is. No, God just is omnipotent, if that makes sense. But I guess one final example is like, I guess an everyday example is like the engine has the power to move the car. Well, in that sense, the car is not going to be, the engine is not going to be identical to its power, right? There's going to be some kind of real distinction there. But for God, God is his power. So he's not going to have power. He is power. And of course, God, when you take the aspectivalist view of this, you can also say that God is goodness. God is his omniscience. God is, these are just kind of, aspects of the omnipotence. So, anyways, let's get, so this is again, this is the view that, me and Tim hold to, and also Sijawadi has proposed. So now let's get into the real meat of it. So we take what's called a narrative approach to probability. So when we treat theism as a hypothesis, this is relatively similar to what's called a scientific hypothesis. Now, how we define theory is basically the same way that Trent Dowdery does, which is that a theory is just a narrative which attempts to tell a coherent and compelling story about the relevant data in such a way as to portray its probable truth. Now, what's interesting is that there's nothing like exclusively scientific about this. So in history, literature, crime solving, medical diagnosis, right, we do the same kind of thing. We try to tell a narrative that tries to tell a story of like how things occur. and you could also say evolution also fits well with this. So when we're talking about the theory of evolution, what we're really talking about is a narrative which attempts to tell a story of how life evolved throughout Earth's history. So when we're talking about theory, we're really just talking about a narrative, right? And then we can sort of incorporate a narrative approach to probability, because again, if we're going to portray a theory as probably true, well, you have to make sure that the theory can really explain all the data in a relevant sense. So now let's get into the next slide. So another thing in regards to this is what's called retrodiction. So I know you titled the presentation, or you titled the video as the predictive power of theism, but really what it's about is what's called the retrodiction power of theism, because when we're talking about prediction, what people typically refer to as a prediction is what's called a forward-looking prediction, right? So basically, you can predict ahead of time what would occur without, referencing the past. But here for theism, what we're actually doing is we're retrodicting from the data. So in science, we often do this, right? So instead of predicting data, we retrodict data from the data we already have. So we ask what is most likely to be the case given our theory and given the total evidence we have available to us, right? So you start off with the content of your theory, which explains the phenomena that needs to be explained after the theory was formed. So even if you have a theory that was formed after some event, you can still explain the event even if it happened in the past, right? And then, of course, you just update by induction. So you can update your theory based on new data, right? Now, there is a view according to which forward-looking predictions generate stronger epicent reasons than do backward-looking ones. This view is called predictivism, and if you want an argument against it, see Swinburne on his book, Epicent Justification. He wrote an appendix on it near the end, but I just want to reference people because I don't want to get into these specifics on critiquing predictivism in this presentation, but the view that forward-looking predictions are more epistemically stronger than backward-looking ones is actually a view that's not really taken seriously within the philosophy of science. So I just want to point that out there in case there's some people that have like, oh, you're not really predicting anything, right? Well, it's like, no, well, you're assuming a view that isn't really taken seriously by philosophers of science, anyways. And there are critiques of that in the literature. So I just want to point that out there. So I guess now we want to get into modeling theistic evidence. Now, I'm going to go over 3 principles in this presentation. The first one is called the diffusiveness principle. So we can say that God is all good, and we say that goodness is necessarily diffusive of itself, right? So this basically means that at a general level, goodness requires something other than itself as a manifestation of itself. Hence, a good being, a maximally good being, would inevitably bring about other good things, right? And of course, you would say that goodness is an essential attribute of God, right? And if that's an attribute of God, then self-diffusiveness is also essential to God. It's essential to goodness itself. So then, what you could say is like God will do something. He's not just going to sit back and not do anything. Now, why is this relevant for theistic prediction? Well, it's relevant because now we start to understand, okay, how is theism able to explain why we live in our kind of world, and I would say that there are principles you can use to get to this. The first one, again, is the diffusiveness principle. So basically the idea that God must do something, so he must have causal powers, right? He's not just going to sit back and not create anything at all. He will do something. Now, the second principle is what's called the plenitude principle. And this is basically the view, or this is a principle where goodness will sort of, you can't contain God's goodness within one creature or one kind of thing. There has to be a multitude of things that God creates, a diversity of good things that God creates. And I'll get more into the specifics on that later. But basically, it's this idea that God brought good things into existence in order to communicate his goodness to creatures and to represent his goodness through them. But since goodness cannot be adequately represented by any one creature, he produces many diverse creatures, so that what was lacking in one's representation of the divine goodness might be supplied by another. For the goodness that exists in a simple and uniform way, so again, if God is, maximally simple, right? So whatever goodness exists within God would exist in a multiplicity of ways, in a divided ways among creatures. Hence, the universe as a whole participates and represents God's goodness in a more perfect way than any one creature does. So I guess one example, one way you can think about this, Suan, is like, if God were to create a world in which it's just me and you that exists, that wouldn't be enough. You need more than that in order for God to fully present his goodness out. So basically, in order for God to really, I guess what it's really saying is, in order for God to really diffuse his goodness into the world, there has to be a diversity of goodness. There can't just be one kind of goodness, right? There has to be like these multiple, and I'll get into the categories later because this is relevant when it comes to the evidence for theism, but at least when it comes to what we can know God to do, just a sort of like, not a priori, but rather like just from bare theism itself, we can sort of see, you know, where these, how does theism explain things? What are we going to expect if God exists? What are we going to expect from that? Well, I would say the first thing we're going to expect is that God would create something. And the second thing we would expect is that God would create a diversity of good things. So that's all I have to say on that. And then the final principle is actually called the ultimate goodness principle. So the ultimate goodness principle is something that I actually came up with because I think this is actually just a consequence of the other principles. But basically, it says that for any S, state of affairs or S can be instantiated by God if at some time T, S bears the axiological status of being good on the whole. So basically what this idea is saying is like, okay, well, if God creates a world, then that world can't be bad on the whole. It has to be good on the whole, right? And so with the axiological status of being good on the whole, what that basically means is like there can't be a world that God creates and then like he just fails in like actualizing its potential or fails in actualizing, what I guess God cannot create a world and then that world just like be destroyed at some point where there like nothing really happens in that world. There's gonna have to be every creature in that world is gonna have to reach this sort of status of being good on the whole.
Mm-hmm. It reminds me a while back on my YouTube channel, I had this discussion with Benjamin Watkins where I was basically kind of talking about classical theism, the euthyphro, and I was laying out my theory of divine ethics, which I never got to finishing, but I had this one principle, and it was something like God's not going to create a world where the situation is just absurd, right? So
Yeah.
let's say a world where God creates a kitten that exists for 5 seconds in utter torment, and then that's the world, and then it comes to a close and that's it, right? Like there's something absurd about that, the pointless. There's no reason that God would invest, if you will, any of his infinite resources into that. So I think what you're saying here is, okay, given that God is this, and we know that God is good, is goodness itself, or just is good, then these types of things are going to follow.
Yeah, and these are logic. So notice how these are logical entailments of theism. So these aren't just, you don't have to assume Christian theism. Like these are just entailed if God exists, like just bare theism itself.
Right. Okay. Mm-hmm.
So, and I just want to point that out because some people might say, oh, well, don't you have to assume the Christian story? Well, I mean, I would say the Christian story can fit within this, but yeah, I mean, these are just entailed from theism itself. So you don't have to assume any kind of religion in order for, this to go through. This is just entailed from the nature of God. That you would get these sort of things. So yeah, I'm glad. It's funny. I didn't know about that you came up with something like that, because it is very similar to this in the sense that like there can't be a world that God creates that like does not reach the status of being good on the whole, right? This ultimate goodness, right? So yeah, we'll get out, and I'll get more into, because this does have implications for the problem of evil. We can get into that later if you want, but these are the three principles that are just part of the higher order theory of theism. So basically, what is the best kind of world? Well, these are going to be what's going to tell us what that world's going to look like. So now let's get into the axiological relevance thesis. Now, this is a thesis that I didn't come up with. This is a thesis that Tim Howard came up with. And unfortunately, he's not here to present it, so I'll try my best to present it here. Basically, it says that for any O, or observation, theism predicts observation if a relation of axiological relevance connects propositions about theism to propositions about observation. So these are kind of the Bayesian ways of looking at it. So theism is going to be probabilistically identical to the probability of observation, theism, and evidence. And you could also say that observation conditional upon theism and evidence is greater. It has a greater probability than the probability of observation and theism and then no evidence, right? So this does relate back to what I said earlier on my positive relevance thesis, or the positive relevance thesis of evidence. So this is kind of modifying that a little bit and applying it to the specific evidence for theism itself, if that makes sense. So basically, evidence for theism is just going to be anything that has axiological relevance. So basically, you could say that axiological relevance is just properties of value, anything that has value properties to them. And I'll get more into that in a minute in regards to what are some examples of this, but I just want to point that out there. So now let's get into how theistic confirmation works. So I don't know if you're familiar with Bayes' theorem, Suan, but this is Bayes' theorem in a nutshell. And you can kind of, the way that me and Tim have set up here is where you put theism and evidence together, and then you get kind of a probabilistic judgment. So let E be some value state, let E star be some disvalue state, let T be theism, and let not T be the negation of theism. So you see that you have evidence and theism is always going to be greater than evidence and not theism. So basically anything with some value is going to be more probable on theism than the negation of theism. But then it also is true for the other case. So if you find some disvalue state, something that's disvaluable, that's going to be more probable on the negation of theism than it is on theism. So this is kind of the way that you can frame it out. I hope that makes sense. So this is how theistic confirmation works. This is how when we're put it in evidence for theism, this is how you want to kind of model it. So now let's get into the evidence for theism specifically and how this kind of works together. So the first thing is that you can actually fit theistic evidence within a 3-category taxonomy. So you have what's called the moral domain, the lethic domain, and then the aesthetic domain. Now this, I would say, is actually derived from the plenitude principle, because there must be a variety of good things, and each of these good things must represent an aspect of God's nature. Now what's interesting is that when me and Tim kind of discovered this, we realized hey, it's often said that God is the true, the good, and the beautiful. And you could just put these in 3 different categories. So you can put this in 3 different categories of evidence, and you can then you can clearly see okay, when we're talking about cosmological arguments or fine-tuning arguments, we can see those fitting within the category of beauty. When we're talking about consciousness and moral agents, you can fit those within the moral taxonomy. So it's interesting that theistic philosophers throughout the centuries have always said God is the true, the good, and the beautiful. And I think that is true, because when you look out into the world, you can see where these different categories, where the true, the good, and the beautiful actually are in the world, and how they're diversified within the world. So yeah, I just want to point that out, that because God has all 3 of these characteristics, then you can sort of identify, okay, well, if there has to be a diversity of good things, then you can identify, okay, which one it fits into. So now let's get into the specific. So this is kind of the different domains of value. So you have the moral domain of value, which is moral agents, moral knowledge, saint making; the elethic domain, which is mathematical truth, logical truth, scientific discoverability; and then the elethic domain, which is an orderly, complex universe, universal beauty, aesthetic impulse, etc. So let's get into specifically each category. So the first one is the moral datum. So you could say that a sufficient number of human beings throughout human existence have exemplified high degrees of saintliness or moral making. So the realization of the highest manifestations, or you could say that they just manifest the highest apex love and highest manifestations of love and consciousness. So you can say that higher states of consciousness and apex love involve an ongoing strive over our primitive selves. It allows us to gain moral knowledge and have an understanding of moral concepts. And again, the reason why this will be evidence for theism is because of the axiological relevance thesis, because the moral datum is going to have some kind of axiological relevance. So you can include moral knowledge, psychophysical harmony, consciousness, all those arguments for theism. You can include that within this category, and that's going to be positive evidence for theism. So again, going back to the Bayesian framework I went over earlier, where E is evidence for theism and E star is not evidence for theism. Well, in this case, it would be E. So in this case, it would have axiological relevance, which means that would confirm theism against its negation, if that makes sense. So this is just one category of evidence. The next category of evidence is the alethic domain. So there are a number of mathematical, logical, and scientific truths that we are to discover via the scientific method and the philosophical method. So humans have the ability to discern truths about the world and have knowledge. We can explain the applicability of mathematics. I know William Lane Craig has presented this argument in his work on the applicability of mathematics and how this is evidence for theism. Or we can use an argument for reason. We could say that reality is fundamentally rational than irrational. So some of the arguments that could fit in this area is like the applicability of mathematics, arguments from reason. Maybe you have some Platonic argument or something. I don't know. But yeah, now it's interesting. I included ontological in here, but I actually think ontological arguments kind of fit within all three categories because there is sort of overlap between the different categories of value. But I hope this makes sense, that you can actually, at least when it comes to the alethic domain and like trying to like discover truths about the world, I would say that's evidence for theism because, again, it has axiological relevance. So anything with axiological relevance is going to be evidence for theism against its negation, right? And this is just one category. Now, finally, probably my favorite category would actually be the aesthetic domain. So you can say that the universe is orderly and runs by gnomic laws. The universe is also vast, and the universe as a whole had a sufficiently large number of aesthetic beauty wonder. So we can consider the fine-tuning as evidence for an orderly world. So that would fit within the aesthetic domain, which means that it would be evidence for theism. The vast universe. So I would actually say that the vastness of the universe actually is evidence for theism. I know there are some atheist philosophers that want to say that like the universe is so big, like why would God create like such a large universe? Wouldn't that be evidence against theism? Well, no, I would say it actually is evidence for theism given the aesthetics, that if you had a small universe, you're not going to get the same kind of aesthetics as you would with a large universe, right? So that's going to fit within the aesthetic domain. And finally, you can also say that the universe evolves through stages, which represents trials that the universe may go through. So some of the categories some of the arguments you might include within this category is contingency arguments, nomenological arguments, fine-tuning arguments, arguments from beauty, would all fit into this category. And it depends on the argument you use, but I would say that, again, we're taking evidence that we already have for theism and then incorporate it into the framework. So you could have this kind of evidence for theism in there. So if we do a comparative analysis, let's just say we have 5 different evidence, then that would confirm theism against its negation. Now, another thing I want to mention is that the atheist can do the same thing except in reverse. So let's say we have some disvalue. Well, then the atheist can kind of do the opposite comparative analysis. I'm not presenting a cumulative argument here, but I just want to point out like this is kind of a framework of how we should look at it. So the atheist is like free to present like some counter argument to this, but if we consider like 5 pieces of evidence that have axiological relevance, then that's going to favor theism against its negation. So now let's answer some objections, and I think this is where it kind of really gets fun when it comes to answering the objections to what I've said so far. So there's 5 objections I want to go over. Let's go over them one at a time. So the first objection is that theism can't explain anything because God is omnipotent. And if God is omnipotent, then there's an infinite number of ways that God can do otherwise. Hold on, let me. Okay. So this objection basically says that, well, Kyle, if you're saying that if God is omnipotent, he can do anything, then we can't know anything about what kind of world God would create, right? But I would say there are 3 fundamental problems with this kind of argument. So the first problem is that this objection just completely ignores the fact that God is motivated by his goodness and not his powers or abilities. So theism doesn't make its predictions, and the evidence for theism is not based on omnipotence, but rather it's going to be based on goodness, right? So if God is goodness, and we look at goodness into the world, that's going to confirm theism, given the axiological relevance thesis, right? So it just completely ignores the fact that like theism isn't making its predictions off omnipotence. It's going to be it's making its predictions off of goodness. Now, the second objection is that even if you have infinite possibilities, So even if we grant for the fact, okay, yeah, there are infinite possibilities that we can choose from, you can still put an epsilon probability that is not 0. So for example, let's say that you're throwing a dart with a point-sized tip at an Euclidean dartboard. Let's say that it is laser guided at the bullseye and that the dartboard has an infinite extent with respect to the Euclidean plane. Now, since a point has 0 measure with respect to the coordinate plane, the mathematical probability of hitting any point of the dart is 0. Yet it is guaranteed that it will hit the board. Now, what does this mean? Well, let's kind of step back and understand what the point is I'm trying to make here. So let's say that I go in front of an infinite dartboard, and let's say, okay, well, the mathematical probability of me hitting any specific point in that dartboard is actually 0. Okay, well, that doesn't tell you anything about where I'm going to hit it. So it's guaranteed that I'm going to hit the dartboard. Okay. Even if the probability is 0 that I'm going to hit any specific point at that dartboard. So right there, that shows that no, there is not a 0 probability that you're going to hit, that God's going to do something. There's always going to be a non-zero probability that God would do something. And if that's the case, then you can epistemically predict what God's going to do based on whatever, axiological framework you have, right? And I presented some of the principles earlier, but I just want to make that point clear. Now, another thing is I also think that this ignores equivalence classes and finite partitions. So even if we say that there is an infinite number of token worlds that God can create, well, I would say there's actually a finite number of type of worlds that God can create. You can also say that God has the ability to choose infinite tokens among finite types, and I'll get into that in a moment, what that looks like. But these are kind of the 3 main problems of this objection. Now, the fourth response I have is actually this. So on the left-hand side, you have the diagram, which has the total axiological space. And then, of course, you have theism, which occupies the entire outcome space of that, okay, probabilistically, right? Because this is a Venn diagram kind of showing how this all works out. So notice how each one of these circles right here is going to be a token world. So let's say we're right here. Well, we're a token world of the type. So the type is the best kind of world. Okay. So even if you have an infinite number of token worlds within the type, you're still going to be able to predict that God will create the best type of world, right? Even if we don't know exactly the token world, at least a priori that we're going to see. And on the right-hand side, you have what really are, I think, the theoretical constraints of theism. So God is never going to go outside this circle. Basically, that you can say that value represents the best kind of world space, right? So any world that's the best kind and type, God's never going to create a world that's outside of that type. So when you consider this fact, then it's just false to say that we can't make predictions of theism, right? Because automatically we see that given God's goodness, we're going to have a world that's always gonna be within the best kind range, if that makes sense. And that God's never gonna go outside this. So I don't know if you have any questions on that first objection.
Yeah, just I have 2 questions. So regarding the first objection that was mentioned, because there's such an emphasis placed on goodness, why would we then why not just call it an omnibenevolence trope and then have omnipotence be an aspect? Just kind of the ordering of things. That's my first question.
Well, so the reason why is because omnipotence is really just about powers, and powers are something that's less ambiguous, right? So one example is I know I used to hold to the view that God is identical to absolute perfection, and then you would get omnipotence, goodness, and all the other attributes from there. But I think it's just too ambiguous. And so the reason why I think we should include omnipotence as kind of the way to describe this is because omnipotence is less ambiguous. Whereas if we just talk about goodness, well, that's not going to really tell us anything about, Not that it's not going to tell us anything about what God is going to do, but rather it's just it's too ambiguous, if you know what I mean.
So would you say then that, like, let's say getting from omnipotence to omnibenevolence is easier than doing it the other way around?
Yeah, and so Sijawadi himself has in his work has, I think, shown that, like, all these things are aspects of omnipotence. They're not necessarily aspects of all goodness.
Okay.
So that's what I would say.
And then regarding the chart that you have on the screen here, so regarding the one on the right, actually, you mentioned how God's only going to build within that circle region, right, of value. And then obviously, but like, I guess if I'm understanding disvalue property, there are obviously things in this world too that are like disvaluable, that aren't really good and are ugly and don't contribute really well to the beauty and order of it, chaos and death. So, I mean, would that be where disvalue goes, or kind of help me understand what disvalue is technically?
So notice, so if you go back to my ultimate goodness principle, if there is disvalue in the world, it can't be permanent.
I see.
It can't be an unredeeming disvalue, if that makes sense. Or let's say an unredeeming evil, as Trent Darday wants to call it. So basically, like, for example, like when we're talking about the problem of evil, right? Some atheists can say, okay, well, here's disvalue, and this is evidence against theism. And I'd actually agree, at least prima facie, okay, well, yeah, that might be I would say a good candidate for disvalue. And I would say that the theist is then going to need a theodicy to explain why the evil, or why that disvalue is actually valuable, like why the disvalue actually produces value. So then you can redirect those states of affairs back into the circle, if that makes sense.
I see what you're saying. Yeah. It's like, I guess for us, we believe that, I guess, evil doesn't happen for no reason, or it's just kind of there and we're like, dang, we can't do it, we can't do anything, or it's like, no, it's there for a reason, and it'll ultimately in a way be redeemed.
So one way you can think about this is the defeat condition. Now, I'm not going to talk about the defeat condition too much in this presentation because this is a problem of evil presentation, but one of the things in my approach to the problem of evil is this idea of defeat condition, where basically that any creature that goes through evil, not only must they be compensated for the suffering they went through, but rather they must identify the meaning behind their suffering, and they must embrace the suffering so they can see the meaning behind it and see the value behind their suffering. And so if they can see the meaning and the value behind their suffering and how it contributed to their identity, then that would actually be, it doesn't mean that the evil therefore is something that's good, but rather the evil was used for something that can contribute to their identity, right? To contribute to them as a person. And there are some, like Trent Dowder, in fact, in his book, The Problem of Animal Pain, goes over this, where he talks about some of the saints actually kind of use their suffering to contribute to who they are, contribute to their identity, and made them a better person, right? So in that case, then it's the evil is not itself disvaluable because it's not an unredeeming quality. The only way that you can say that evil is actually evidence against theism is to say that it's an unjustified evil, that it's an evil that can't be redeemed or can't be defeated. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah.
So anyways, let's go to the next objection. So the second objection is basically that if we have axiology as our background knowledge, then this decreases the prior probability of theism because it requires additional claims about value states as part of the theistic hypothesis. So basically it's this idea that, like, okay, well, the axiology that you're using, Kyle, like the principles that you're using, well, these are additional claims like that you're adding to theism in order to generate these predictions. Well, this is actually, there's, I think, 3 different responses to this I have. So the first response I have to this is that this is actually just assuming an orthodox view of Bayesianism rather than explanationist view. So in explanationism, the intrinsic probability is not determined by the number of claims it makes, but rather the intrinsic probability of a world is a function of how simple are the highest level hypotheses which it contains and how well they are able to explain all the other propositions in which the world contains, rather than the modesty of the overall worldview. So even if you have more claims right, in your overall theory, that's not going to decrease the priors, because probabilities are all conditional, right? In this case, then you could say that theism makes its predictions based off. So you could think of it like this: God, it is entailed from theism that God will create the best kind of world. But then identifying what is the best kind of world is going to be informed by your higher order theory, which is your axiology. And once you have your axiology, then that informs you of what theism is going to predict. So in other words, you could say that the higher order axiology are upstream propositions that then downstream to theism. So then the overall probability, like from top to bottom, doesn't change at all, right? Because again, if we're operating under explanationism, all probabilities are conditional. There's no unconditional probabilities. And if that's the case, then the intrinsic probability is a function of how the higher order theories will then inform the lower order theories, if that makes sense. So once you have that, and you can do it, consistently, you're not going to lose on overall probability at all, right? Because again, if theism entails that God will create the best kind of world, well, what's going to inform me about what's the best kind of world? What's going to inform me is your higher order theory, which then downstreams probabilistically down to theism. So then you're not going to lose probability overall, right? So I think that this objection actually just completely it assumes an orthodox view of Bayesianism, and that's just not the view that I'm using here. So the second, I would say, response I have to this objection is that these axiological truths, or the axiology that I'm using, are simply the principles of logic applied to axiological concepts. So that means they are analytical truths and don't need to have their own justification, right? So think of it like this. I'm not assuming more realism. I'm not assuming that these values are like stance-independent values, but rather they are analytical truths. And if you apply the principles of logic, if you apply the principles of logic to these axiological concepts, so not talking about axiological concepts as these stance-independent moral truths, but rather just concepts in and of themselves, we apply logic to that, then you get it. So for example, we can say that it is wrong to punish the innocent. Okay. Now, the reason why it's wrong to punish the innocent is not because of some stance independent thing, but rather it's just contained within the definition. Like, because by definition, you're not going to punish someone that's innocent, right? So I hope that that's just one example, but that kind of makes sense. If you have any questions, Suan, you can.
I mean, what you're basically saying is, these aren't like these axiological value states that you're talking about. These aren't like separate things that you're tacking on to theism.
Yeah.
It's like they're in the hypothesis, if you will, already.
Yeah,
You're
just
kind
like
of pointing them out.
just
Mhm.
like the laws of logic are kind of going to be part of any hypothesis, right?
Right.
It's not like the laws of logic are like, oh, you have to assume them, and then it's like, no, like they're already part of the hypothesis already,
It's like, yeah, my hypothesis doesn't have the laws of logic, therefore it's simpler than yours. Yeah, no, that's not how that.
Yeah. So yeah, that's kind of the way I like to put it, is like, yeah, I mean, it's already part of the hypothesis. I mean, any hypothesis is going to have some assumptions, just because, if you take away the laws of logic, say, oh, my hypothesis is simpler, therefore has a higher prior probability. It's like, that just sounds absurd. Like, that just wouldn't really work. So yeah, so now the third, this is actually a more technical objection or technical response that I have. I'll go over it briefly. Basically, it actually ignores confirmational holism. So most hypotheses, especially within science, typically rest upon background assumptions from which to derive predictions. So as an example, we could say that I think it's the theory of evolution. Well, okay, maybe let's use a more contemporary example. The theory of quantum mechanics depends upon our prior information about Newtonian mechanics and other theories, right? So that's your background assumption you're using. And I would say the same thing applies to theism. But in this case, for theism, the background system is a value system. It's an axiology, right? So if God will create the best kind of world, then you're going to have to assume some kind of values in the background to kind of make the predictions about what that's going to look like. So yeah, I think it just completely ignores this idea of confirmational holism. That yeah, I mean, you're going to have to make some background assumptions, but that's not going to really decrease the probability of your hypothesis. Because I mean, every scientific theory or whatever has to do that anyways. So I hope that makes sense on the third point. So the second objection is actually more interesting. And this objection is basically that axiology is just arbitrary, right? So we're just kind of picking and choosing what is valuable and disvaluable. And so you could say, okay, well, Kyle, like, you're just choosing what is valuable and disvaluable. And yet it just so happens to be in our world. So it's cheating, right? But I would say there's several problems with this objection. So the first one is just basically that any feature of the world that can be identified as valuable is a motivation for God to realize it. And then also consider the fact that these are, again, analytical truths, right? So it's not like, we're just picking and choosing, like these are just analytically true about the world, right? You could say that value states are prima facie allude to God. So another thing is that higher order axiological theories inform us as to what is valuable and what is not. And so then what the theist can do here is actually we can learn about what is valuable and disvaluable by looking out into the world, right? And so if the theist is within their theory can identify constituent axiological justifications for thinking X is valuable, then they can derive predictions in a consistent way. And so this isn't subjective. This isn't like I'm just picking and choosing. Like these are things that we actually discover in the world, just like we discover, that the earth is round or, stuff like that, right? These are things that we actually do discover in the world. And this is kind of how theism works as a research project. And I'll get more into that a little bit later. But yeah, so we can discover, like, for example, I'll give you a few examples. So one argument for theism that's relatively new is what's called psychophysical harmony. And I would say that argument is actually an example of something we can identify as valuable that theism predicts. Or we could say more recent discoveries in, like, for example, like if you come up with some new contingency argument or something. I know, Suan, you have your own moral argument. Those are like examples of like when we come up with these new arguments, what we're really doing is we're identifying new valuable states of the world. And we're showing why these are evidence for theism. So it's not subjective at all, right? So that's what I have to say on that. So now let's get into, I think, what's the more interesting objections to what I've been saying here so far, which is that naturalists are free to parody this framework so that naturalism can actually make the same predictions as theism. So there are, I would say, 3 different parody methods that naturalists kind of use. So the first one is what's called the stalking horse objection. Hold on, I need to... So the first one is stalking horse, which is basically, this is from Alex Mappas, and basically it goes like this. So you replace axiology, God desires X, with natural dispositions, which is that natural reality is disposed to do X. Therefore, you can just make the same exact predictions that I've been doing. Or a second way you can do it is what's called naturalistic modality, or you can explain by necessity. So this is popularized by Graham Oppie, right? And this is especially helpful, like, his responses to certain contingency arguments use the same kind of reasoning. And then finally, the third way you could do it is to have each category of evidence as a brute good, right? So you don't actually need theism or God to really explain any of the evidence for theism itself. So this is my response to the first one, which is that natural dispositions cannot link naturalism or the hypothesis of indifference in the same way that axiology connects to theism. Because on naturalism, fundamental reality is axiologically indifferent, right? If natural reality is axiologically indifferent, then you're not going to be able to like parody theistic explanation. And adding in disposition, so adding in, okay, well, reality just has this natural disposition to do this. Well, that doesn't help the naturalist, since nothing flows from indifference to natural dispositions. You don't actually get any kind of natural disposition from naturalism, right? Again, if we're assuming naturalism as the hypothesis of indifference, which is basically that reality is morally indifferent, it's axiologically indifferent, it just kind of acts on its own. There's no like, it's just completely random or so I guess one way you can think of it is like, reality is just not, it has, well, basically, well, maybe I should give my definition of naturalism. So my definition of naturalism briefly is just that natural reality. Well, sorry, I think it's. Let me see if I can get my notes on this. I'm sorry, Suan. I kind of lost my train of thought there.
No, you're fine. I mean, typically, as I've understood it, naturalism is just the idea that nature is a closed system, right? You don't need to refer to any other supernatural entities. You
Yeah.
just need the natural world.
So this is how I define naturalism: is that there are only non-normative, non-intentional substances and laws governing change. And then axiarchism, briefly, I'll go over that in a minute, but axiarchism says that there is a fundamental normative but non-intentional principle governing creation and change. So those are the two definitions that I have. Now for naturalism specifically, because nature is non-normative, non-intentional, it's not going to really give you any, like, the only way that naturalism can make predictions is if you have naturalism and then some background knowledge. That's the only way you can do it. But if you add a natural disposition, that doesn't flow from naturalism itself, right? So it's not going to really, you're not going to be able to, because on theism, again, the reason why axiology flows from theism is because God is all good, right? Because God is just, by definition, it's just entailed from the definition of theism that God would be disposed to creating good things. Whereas on naturalism, you don't get the definition to, natural reality is just has these dispositions. That doesn't work. In fact, I would say that if you're going to do that, so if the atheist is going to go this route, then the naturalist is actually going to postulate the very data that needs to be explained. So it doesn't actually really explain the data. You just kind of like have to add these on to the hypothesis, which is going to decrease the simplicity and prior probability of the hypothesis in question. So that's kind of the main issue, at least if you're going to do this strategy.
So is the idea that like naturalism, as you put it, is indifferent, let's say, right?
Yeah.
So, it's not like there was a creator or any sense of, I guess, axiology to begin with. That is to say, there's nothing normative to begin with. You get natural dispositions, which is in a way normative in nature, right? You get a pattern or something, but it's like, where did that come from?
Yep.
If you have that starting point.
Yeah, and that's kind of the main issue, is if you're going to do that, then it seems like you're just postulating the very data that needs to be explained in the first place, which means you're not, which means like the content within the explanandum is going to be the same as the content within the theory. And that's not, because a good theory is a theory that you can explain a lot from a little, right? So notice how, on my view of theism, God is one entity, zero properties, zero kinds, right? It's just one omnipotence trope that just acts towards goodness. So then you get goodness from that. It's entailed from the definition. But on naturalism, you can't do that. On naturalism, reality is indifferent. Well, where are the predictions going to come from on that kind of view? It doesn't seem like, unless you build in some background knowledge, you're not going to be able to do that. So that's, I hope that makes sense, Suan. So now let's get into the next one. So this is my response to Graham Oppy's parity method. So typically, Oppy will say, well, we can just, create this, let's say, naturalistic modality. And so any world that if the actual world shares some similarity with the initial state or whatever, and the initial state is necessary, then you can kind of explain all this, right? That's actually not going to work. So modality and explanation by necessity doesn't help. Consider this following scenario. Let's say that it is metaphysically necessary that you have laws which entail that crystals will naturally form to read out John 3:16. Now, this would be epistemically strong theism, even if it is a metaphysical necessity that you have these laws. So again, it is metaphysically necessary that you have laws which entail this. But this that doesn't mean that therefore that it doesn't favor Christian theism, right? Just because it's metaphysically necessary. So even if I grant, for the sake of argument, that there are these necessities, and even if we use modality to kind of model this out, theism is still going to be more epistemically likely when we actually fill in the evidence. So when we fill in any kind of evidence that has axiological relevance, it's going to, that evidence is always going to be more probable on theism than naturalism, right? Even if we say that the evidence in question is metaphysically necessary or even if we can explain it by some modality or whatever. And so this applies across any evidence within our framework. And so I would say that the fundamental problem with this objection is that it confuses metaphysical necessity with epistemic probability, right? So modality, metaphysical necessity is irrelevant to epistemic probability, right? And then another thing is like something natural is always neutral with respect to value states. So it cannot parrot theistic explanations when theistic explanations are parsed out in terms of axiology. So any kind of parity method that attempts to explain by necessity, like for example, let's say the fine tuning, let's just say, oh, well, it's metaphysically necessary that fine tuning exists. That's not going to work. Because if we parse out fine tuning in terms of axiological relevance, we bring in the axiological relevance thesis, that's always going to favor theism against naturalism, even if it is metaphysically necessary that you have this. And you could just see from the example I gave that, okay, yeah, we grant metaphysical necessity if it comes to, like, let's say crystals that naturally form the readout John 3:16, but that's not gonna really do anything. So that's not gonna help the naturalist.
Right. And why would the naturalist want to parse things out in terms of axiology?
No, I'm not. No, I would say the theist wants to do it. Yeah. Sorry, did I mispronounce there, Suan?
No. I'm just trying to figure out. I mean, suppose that the naturalist. Let's see. So could you explain the second response, the B response again?
Yeah. So something natural is always going to be neutral. So we just say, well, something's natural. Well, that's not going to really tell you anything about axiology, right? Yeah. It's not going to tell you whether natural is going to be disposed to some value states, right? So that's why saying, oh, well, it's just natural, that's not going to help the naturalist, right? So yeah, that's what I would say in response. And notice how throughout the presentation, I haven't mentioned anything about, God being supernatural. So if people say, oh, aren't you saying, Kyle, that you have to invoke this supernatural being? I don't even think God is supernatural in the way that I've defined him. So we can just throw out those terms entirely. But yeah. Any more questions to me before I continue, or?
No, we can move on.
Okay. So now let's get into my third response. So this one's actually, I think this is the best option for the non-theist. So axiarchism is a view where things just exist because it's good for them to exist, right? And I would say, like, if you want to explain things in terms of axiological relevance, right? If you want to try to parrot these explanation, this is the best way to go, because you're not having to, because you're no longer talking about naturalism or the hypothesis of indifference. Rather, you're operating under an axiarchist view of explanation, which is basically just going to explain things in terms of goodness. But I have three kind of general responses to the axiarchist view. So first of all, is that axiarchism is not a simple explanation. It has to posit many brute items in the ontology. It doesn't flow from axiarchism that you get, let's say, a diversity of good things or whatever. It leaves more unexplained, and we are left with more explanatory questions. And of course, it doesn't fit with background knowledge. So for example, just saying, well, things exist because it's good for them to exist, that doesn't fit with our background knowledge. Like, I'm not going to say, well, the reason why I'm here on doing this stream is just because it's good for me to do so. Like, that's not going to really explain, anything. So I think I would say that's the first problem. The second problem is that axiarchism doesn't tell us the kinds of goods that would come about, right? So it's not going to get the same taxonomy that theism does. So again, going back to the theistic taxonomy, we have alethic, moral, aesthetic. You're not going to get that from axiarchism, because axiarchism doesn't tell us the kinds of goods that are going to come about, right? It's more ambiguous about the kinds of goods that are going to come about. And finally, axiarchism doesn't say that we would be in the best kind of world, or that there would be a plenitude of good things. So this is basically saying that it's not going to have as much explanatory power. And the reason for that is because on theism, God will do the best action. The probability that God would do a best action is 1, whereas in axiarchism, you don't get that same probability. So it's more ambiguous. It's not going to entail a best kind of world. So you're not going to be able to identify exactly what that's going to look like. right? You're not going to be able to. You're also not going to be able to. So, like the principles I went over earlier, I would say the Axiarchists can't use those because those are specific to the best kind of world, right? That's the That's the that's the axiology we're using, at least for theism. But Axiarchism doesn't get you that. It doesn't get you the same kind of explanationist framework that the theist would get you. So that's all I have to say in response to the Axiarchists. If you have any questions before I get to the last objection, because I do have one more. But
it's like a bad theism light, you know, like really light.
It is. Well, that's the thing. I think Axiarchism is an interesting hypothesis, but I would say it definitely has deficiencies. So yeah, that's all I have to say on that. And finally, we have what I would actually consider this the best objection, which is what's called the fallacy of understated evidence. So the fallacy of understated evidence goes like this. You identify some general fact F about a topic X that is antecedently more likely on theism than on naturalism, but you ignore other more specific facts about X, facts that given F are more likely on naturalism than on theism. So when we're talking about this, we're talking about antecedent probability, and antecedent probability just means probability independently. So before we looked at evidence, that's what antecedent basically means, right? So you have antecedent and then consequent. Well, antecedent probability is just probability independently of the evidence. So one example, I'll give some examples of what this might look like later, but this is basically what the fallacy is saying. So in order for the fallacy to understated evidence to be successful, the naturalist must show that the evidence for theism does depend on the evidence for naturalism, that the first order data, which is expected on theism, is overcome by some higher order evidence that the theistic paradigm cannot address, or there is not some theistic narrative in the background that can be derived. So let me give you, I guess, an example of an argument from understated evidence. So let's say that consciousness is evidence for theism, but then we include the fact, well, consciousness, as far as we know, depends upon brains. And so if it depends upon some physical substance or whatever, that's going to be evidence for naturalism, because that's the only way that we could really have, let's say, conscious agents on naturalism. So then that additional fact that consciousness depends upon brains is actually evidence for naturalism in that case. But I would say that the best, there's 4 general strategies that I have in responding to this, but I would say that the theist can answer this objection by filling out the full context of the evidence. So Swinburne actually does this in his book, The Existence of God, on chapter 6. He goes over the evidence for consciousness and moral agents, and he talks about how they need to be situated within a public environment in order for them to grow certain moral virtues, right? So as long as the evidence that you're using for theism can fit within a theistic narrative, I went over narrative probability earlier, as long as you can fit it within a story of how all the evidence sort of fits together, we can see how all the relevant evidence would kind of work into this package, right? I don't want to get too much into details there because I want to go over some of the strategies that theists can use when responding to this. But let me just give you some examples, other examples of how the understated evidence objection would work out. So let's consider that moral virtue is evidence for theism, but then we have moral evil as evidence for naturalism. Okay, well, we can grant for the sake of argument that moral evil would fit within the naturalist outcome space. But then the issue is that moral virtue is still going to take up the large majority of, or theism is going to take up the large majority of the moral agents outcome space, given axiological relevance, right? There's some other examples like humans occupy universe, humans occupy a small area of universe. Okay, what we can do is, okay, we can give a sliver of the outcome space to naturalism, but theism's still going to take up the large majority of the case. And of course, you can apply this all across the board. So any quote unquote understated evidence, right? Or, the example I just bring up. So conscious agents depend on brains, fits within naturalism, but then conscious agents, just the outcome space of consciousness is going to be occupied by theism. So really what you could say, Suan, is like the outcome space for theism is always going to occupy the axiological relevant space. But then what the naturalists can do is say, okay, well, we have some, let's say, disvalue within the value, if that makes sense. And that this value is actually going to be evidence for naturalism, right? But then the theist can say, okay, well, okay, I'll grant you the fact, okay, this might be some disvalue, right? But theism's still going to overtake the large majority of the outcome space. So what the naturalist is going to have to do, so again, going back to my example, in order for the fallacy to work, they have to show that this evidence right here, that moral virtue actually depends upon moral evil, or that humans occupy universe actually depends upon humans occupy small area. Otherwise, you're going to have this problem where the vast majority of the outcome space is actually going to be occupied by the theist and not the naturalist. Right? I hope that makes sense. So now let's get into the 4 strategies in responding to this objection. So the first, so we can consider like all 4 of these strategies is going to be working within a narrative probability. We're using a narrative approach to probability. So when doing a narrative probability, as long as the narrative, so long as the story we're telling, let's say it's some sort of theodicy or some reason why God would allow for some disvalue to occur, as long as the narrative is consistent with the antecedent probability principles, then it doesn't decrease overall probability. What does that mean? Well, what it means is that as long as the narrative you're telling is not incompatible with your axiology, then it's not going to decrease overall probability. Because again, if we're using explanationism, we have axiology as our higher order theory. We have theism. So then anything from the axiology is going to downstream from the axiology probabilistically down to theism, which then that's the story you tell, if that makes sense. Let me see if okay. So yeah, that's basically, as long as you can do that. So as long as you can tell a story which is consistent with your axiology, then the axiology is actually going to downstream. So then the probability between them is actually not going to change at all. So it's not going to decrease priors. You don't have to change it's not going to antecedently, it's going to be as expected, if that makes sense. And also this also is relevant for like Bayesian updating. I don't want to get into Bayesian updating here, but that's another sort of strategy that I like to use, especially certain arguments from like the pain and pleasure argument, for example. You could do that. If you have any questions about that later, Savannah, you can ask me that. But so now let's get into the 4 strategies. So the first strategy is that what I said earlier, which is that you give some outcome space to the naturalist, but you show why theism still takes up the large majority of the outcome space, right? And I guess you could say like this strategy is probably the weakest one in the sense of like you're kind of granting the objection a little bit, but you're still saying like, okay, yeah, it's true that while consciousness depends on brains as evidence for naturalism, consciousness is still going to be more probable on theism, right? Overall, right? The second strategy is to give a theistic narrative to show why the specific evidence, so why the understated evidence given doesn't actually disconfirm theism. So one way you could do this is give, let's say there's some evil in the world, like moral evil. You give a theodicy to explain why there can be moral evil within a theistic narrative. So then you can kind of shave off the disconfirmatory power, and that's going to clear that up. The third strategy is one that Trent Dowdery uses on his book, The Problem of Animal Pain. Basically, you give a theistic narrative to show why the specific evidence for theism actually favors theism, right? So Trent Dowdery gives a likelihood argument from animal pain to show why animal pain is actually more likely on theism than naturalism, given the kind of intensity and frequency. I don't want to get into his arguments here, but that's kind of another strategy you can use. And then finally, the 4th strategy would just show how the actual understated evidence actually backfires against the naturalists. How when we get to more specific facts, then it would actually favor theism against naturalism. So this is my conclusion of my presentation. So modeling theistic evidence in terms of axiology precludes naturalistic parodies. So any objections from Malpass or Graham-Oppie, if you're going to try to do a stalking horse objection or try to explain my necessities, that's not going to work against this framework. This is a general framework for understanding theism's explanatory power. So this isn't like this isn't like I'm not presenting a new kind of argument for theism, but rather I'm showing how you can use the evidence or the arguments that we already have and fit it within a framework. And again, this isn't a cumulative argument. It was meant to show how arguments from natural theology can be incorporated into the framework that me and Tim have developed. And when we do this, it can actually be immune from certain objections, like it can be immune from naturalistic parodies. It can be immune from the understated evidence as long as you're being consistent there. And then, yeah, that's my presentation. So yeah, theism is a progressive research project, and I think that's it.
All right, Kyle, I appreciate the presentation. We do have, I think one audience member who's asking a lot of good questions. His name is Kevin Non-Tradicath. I hope I said that right.
Yeah.
So he says, essay Electrons in Love essentially argues that God could have given minds to electrons, since God isn't bound by the natural laws. This seems to undermine much of the predictive power of theism. And then he says again, see above. Would you agree that the fact that God isn't bound by natural laws removes much of the predictive power of theism? Maybe that's the more succinct form of the question.
Yeah, so it's interesting because natural laws, again, we're talking about axiological relevance. So another thing to notice is how, so I actually think the electrons in love objection does undercut some fine-tuning arguments depending upon how you frame them. Mm-hmm. So if you're not going to use fine-tuning as something if you're not going to use, let's say, axiological relevance, and if you're just going to talk about in terms of just laws of nature, and you're not going to like reference God's goodness or anything like that, then I would, or if you're going to say that, oh, well, God's omnipotence explains this, I actually agree with the electrons in love objection if you include that as a part of your fine-tuning argument. But if your fine-tuning argument does cite axiological relevance, so the fact that it is valuable for God to create an aesthetic universe with orderly laws, right? And that, I know Swinburne himself has kind of argued that moral agents would actually need a fine-tuned cosmos in the first place, and that you can't have the same kind of moral and valuable states within a universe like electrons in love universe. Then I would say that an electrons in love unit, so that's the first thing I would say, is that it depends upon the argument. The second thing is that it depends on whether fine-tuning is axiological relevance. So if it is, the electrons in love objection is not going to work. And then the third problem I would say with the electrons in love objection, at least in reference, if I'm using my framework as the background, is that it's actually incompatible. So a universe in which there's only electrons is actually incompatible with the plenitude principle already. So the probability that God would create an electrons in love universe is actually zero given my axiology. So again, we have axiology, theism. The axiology probabilistically downstreams to theism, which means that theism is going to make predictions off of the axiology. And if the axiology precludes an electrons in love scenario, then it's actually not possible, or it's not the epicenter probability that God would create an electrons in love universe is actually zero. So in that case, I would say that while it is true to say that God isn't bound by natural laws, God is going to be bound by the higher order theory, the higher order axiology. I mean, because again, that's how theism is making its predictions. Because if we're using an explanationist framework, that's how it all kind of probabilistically downstreams. So I would say, the electrons in love objection does undercut some objections of fine-tuning, but not all of them. So that's what I would say.
All right, second question from Kevin again. Question 2, I joined late, but all of what I caught had to do with axiology. As an anti-realist about morality, I am not super moved by axiology. Did you cover non-axiological arguments for the predictive power of theism in the beginning?
No, because I mean the entire framework that I'm using. So I guess the first question is, okay, well, don't you have to assume? Well, no, because axiology is just that's just those are just like analytical truths. So I'm not saying that these are stance independent moral truths, right? So you can still be a moral anti-realist and hold to what I'm saying here. It's just you would have to say that the axiological truths are analytical truths, right? They're necessary axiological truths rather than truths that are stance independent in the moral realist sense of the term. So that's what I would say. And then, of course, I would say again that any argument for theism that doesn't have isn't in reference to axiology or isn't in reference to value, that will be susceptible to the nationalistic parodies that I mentioned earlier, which means that there's going to be a lot of hurdles that it's going to have to overcome. And what I'm saying is, like, if you incorporate the evidence for theism within axiology, then those are going to be completely immune to any of those parody methods, if that makes sense. So that's why if you're going to try to make an argument from God independently of axiology, it's not going to work within my framework. So,
Right.
yeah.
And the axiology you're saying is just packed in with theism.
Yeah.
Okay. So third question. What are some of the unconfirmed predictions that follow from theism that you might think would be confirmed in our lifetimes?
So it depends. So, I mean, 20 years ago, we didn't have the psychophysical harmony argument. Now, of course, now that's a confirmed prediction. If we continue doing research on fine tuning, we discover even more fine tuning. That would be an unconfirmed prediction. Another thing is, what's another example? Yeah, so like any like arguments for theism that depends upon, let's say, empirical premises that we discover in the future is going to be some unconfirmed predictions. So yeah, that's all I have to say on that. Another thing is, like, maybe I'm still thinking about how arguments for miracles would fit into my framework, but any kind of new miracles that come up would also be an unconfirmed prediction. So yeah.
Would another unconfirmed prediction be, I don't know, God redeeming the world ultimately? And
Yeah, that's the other thing is
that's something we're waiting on.
yeah, definitely.
All right. Yeah, so I'm gonna let Kyle just do a few more questions. Or excuse me, Kevin, a few more questions. We're getting a lot of guys with K letters.
Yeah.
Let's see. Kevin says, I don't know why an electrons in love universe must be axiologically inferior to a universe like ours.
Right. So it depends upon your axiology, right? So notice if, like, for example, I would say the reason why it's axiologically inferior is because it's not consistent with the plenitude principle. So universes in which there's only electrons would actually not be compatible with my plenitude principle. Because while you may have aesthetic beauty, you're not going to have, or aesthetic value, I should say, you're not going to have moral value. You're not going to, so it's actually not going to be able to fully reflect God's own nature in that case. So that's what I would say.
Okay.
And it's also,
and
it's also not going to be compatible with the ultimate goodness principle either. I would say. So yeah.
Kevin asked the question too. I might need to talk to you more about that axiology and moral anti-realism playing nice together, because I'm not sure I rightly understand that right now.
Yeah. So if you're interested, there's a paper called, let me see if I can find the exact paper on my documents, that actually does sort of talk about this a little bit. Hold on. Okay. Oh, wait. Hold on. God's. Okay, so there's a paper by, this is going to sound, you've probably never heard of this philosopher. There's a paper by Tim Mawson. It's called God's Creation of Morality. And he provides a solution to the Euthyphro dilemma, and he uses a lot of the ideas that I'm using here when we're talking about, these just being like necessary axiological truths rather than stance independent truths as moral realism requires. So I would say if we understand the axiological truths as analytical rather than stance independent, then it would be fully compatible with moral anti-realism.
All right, Kyle, I think I'm going to wrap up the stream now. But Kevin's very interested in your work, and I really appreciate how he came in at the end because he, I think he brought a lot of good comments and interesting questions in. Let's see here. Kevin actually said, "I would be more than happy to talk to you or Kyle on your shows or on mine at any time. You've got a fan in me." That's really nice.
No problem.
All right. Well, we'll look into that. But anyway, that's today's episode. I want to thank Kyle for coming on today. And Kyle, is your YouTube? I mean, so it's still Christian Idealism, right? That's the main channel that you're working on.
Yeah, and I'm actually, it's kind of weird because like I'm not a metaphysical idealist anymore. So the understanding of my name is a little bit different than when I originally started. But I still use it just because idealism doesn't have to be metaphysical. It doesn't have to be a metaphysical thesis. So yeah.
All right. Well, Kyle, I appreciate your kind comments at the beginning of the show, and thank you once again for coming on.
No problem. Thank you for having on me, Suan.